Okay, so Jake and I are here this afternoon to talk to you about cortical structures, and we're going to start out by looking at this brain. So the first thing that it says to do on your worksheet is to bisect or look at after I've bisected the brain. So I'm going to bisect the brain just like this. Put that other part right there for a moment. And so the first question that it's asking you is when the cortex was bisected, what kind of cut was it? Is it transverse, coronal, or sagittal? So answer that on your sheet. Now, when we look at this part of the brain, we have two parts that the cerebrum can be divided into. Okay, so we've got, the cortex. So we have these two parts. So the question on the sheet there is, what two lobes can constitute this upper portion? So it might help to look from the inside as well, but this piece right here is really representing two parts of the cerebral cortex. The next question is, what two parts of the cortex, what two lobes are represented by this part? So you may have to go back to your notes or the book to be able to get those answers, but that's the first part that we're asking for there. And then the other question is very simple. It's kind of like, duh, what are these? So we have these other structures that also belong to this hemisphere of the brain. So, whoops, we're going to put them back in. Oops, get them oriented the way they should be, okay? So it's kind of like an IQ test. Can you do it? That's what it would look like. Okay, so you've identified all these parts. Now, the next question says, it says to reconnect the cerebrum, which I did. It says to identify the cavity that you see once the cortical structures are reconnected. So what is this cavity in here? Okay, we know that there's something that goes in there, but does it fill it completely? I think you'll see that the answer is no. So if we open this up and investigate this cavity a little more closely, you can see that it opens this way, removing this superior part. But looking at the inferior part, you can see that there's shape there, and it comes to a point here. What is that, and what is it shaped like? Okay, so that's what we're talking about when you're looking at that question on your worksheet. Okay, now it says to locate the occipital horn of the lateral ventricle, and you can do that and talk about the shape. And now what I want to do is replace this brain stem into the top portion of the cerebrum. Okay, so it's going to sit about like this. So it's not flush because we have this space here, and you can see it doesn't completely fill in the space. So I've asked a question at the bottom there, which says, visualizing from the bottom, locate the lateral ventricle, and then what part of this cavity does this diencephalon occupy? So it's, I'll show you in a moment, this is 1/2 of the diencephalon, so obviously there's two to make it be di. But just wanting you to kind of get a good visual of how this all fits together and what percentage, just guess, is it 100% full of brainstem, or is there room in there? Okay, is it 50% full, 85, what's the other option, 33? So select the one that you think is right, okay? So this is the end of this part. I want to, for a moment, just concentrate on the cortex again. Later on in the worksheet, we're going to stop at this point, have you look at some links where we'll talk about cerebrospinal fluid and circulation. We'll also look at the vascular supply to the brain for the there's a whole link on the circle of Willis and blood supply to the brain. What I wanted to show you here is that these red lines, which have gotten a little worn off over the years as our students handle these brains, but you can see that there are some arteries that are coming out from this lateral fissure and kind of wrapping up around the brain this way, okay? There are some that are originating from the mid, well, in a mid-sagittal view you can see, but you can see they're coming up from the central part, and they actually kind of have some arterial supply that just comes over the midline at the top. So no matter where the blood supply comes from, these spaces in between the fingertips are going to be, both arteries are going to branch out so that every surface of the brain obviously has blood supply. Okay, so at the very end there's a worksheet that shows this same view of the brain. Okay, so we're looking at it from the medial surface, and it's going to ask you to color. You didn't know you were going to be coloring in a university class, did you? So we want you to color the ACA, okay, so the anterior cerebral artery in red, and color the posterior cerebral artery in blue. Okay, so you have to figure out, based on these branching arteries, which one is which, and color code them. And then the next question is, can you see the middle cerebral artery from this view? Yes or no?
Okay.
So we had a very industrious TA make this several years ago, and we've kept it in the lab because it's really great. It took a lot of work. So what you see is blood supply coming from the heart, right, the aorta here. We also have blood supply coming into the vertebral arteries. So can you tell what this artery would be that branches off from the aorta? There's an artery moving to the front. One is internal, one is external. So what would this one be? This one is called the external carotid artery. So then that makes this one what? If this one's external, this is the internal carotid artery, okay? Then we have an artery that branches off and goes to the lateral surface of the brain, okay? And that one would go this way as well. We have the carotid branches to a forward section, and what would these arteries be? So we have the anterior cerebral arteries, middle, anterior, and then really interesting things happen in the back, okay? So you've got the vertebral arteries going through the vertebrae, okay? And they anastomose to form the basilar artery, and then they separate again, and we get the posterior cerebral arteries, okay? Now, you have supply to the circle of Willis. This is the circle of Willis here. You have a posterior supply covering this part, and you have an anterior supply that's provided by the internal carotid arteries. If you didn't have a connection between the two, if you had a problem, let's say you had a problem over here or over here, okay? If you had a problem in this carotid artery, there'd be no way to serve that portion of the brain. But this is like a big insurance policy here, so that if you have a lesion that is somewhere above the level of the vertebral and carotid arteries, you can get supply. It's like a superhighway of extra blood supply. And so if there's a problem over here, you can get blood from the vertebral supply. The posterior avenue can then send blood. Let's say there's a problem here. You can get blood that would come from another source and still serve the brain. And so we have these arteries here are called the posterior connecting or communicating arteries, which connect the posterior supply to the anterior supply. There are two of them here. We have, this is considered part of the carotid or part of the ACA. The MCA and the ACA are what result when the carotid splits. And then we have this tiny little anterior communicating artery that connects the left and right sides of the anterior blood supply. So this is a little bit wiggly and unwieldy, but it gives you a kind of a good 3D idea of what's going on with the circle of Willis and how it looks so different than some of the illustrations in your books and slides that look like that. So this gives you an idea of where it is in space.